It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck, and of course, once again, some very smart talk radios in your future. In this segment, no exception. We have talked about drink. We've talked about American drink. We have never, in 500 some odd shows, ever talked specifically about the topic of moonshine. Well, today that will happen with Jaime Joyce. Who's Jaime Joyce? First of all, her day job, she's an editor at Time Inc. Her work has appeared in Edible Manhattan, Edible Brooklyn, and the online edition of The Atlantic. She also is on the Big Round Table, which is a website for long-form narrative nonfiction. She has a master's degree at Bank Street College of Education and Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. She has an interesting topic here. We will explore it in depth for the next several minutes. Jaime, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Well, I think we're very good here. I know while this show is airing, most times on a Sunday morning, the topic of moonshine is never one that it always holds people's interest. The work is called Moonshine, A Cultural History of America's Infamous Liquor. You are an editor at Time Kids, I believe.
That is correct. Time for Kids.
Yes, you have written some very sophisticated work. Not that moonshine isn't a non-sophisticated subject, but why, Jaime, of all the things Jaime Joyce could write about, why moonshine?
Well, moonshine, first of all, it's for kids who are over 21. Let's just start with that. It's inappropriate for the younger set. Moonshine is really, it's a great American spirit, and it's a great American story, and so that intrigued me, and I was so compelled by that and had to write a book about it.
I have a question for you. When you started doing the research on moonshine in general, did you see any parallels with those that moonshine? Are there any parallels with today's latter-day moonshiners growing marijuana in Northern California and Colorado?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I write in the book about how a lot of these marijuana farmers were sort of taking over the moonshine business in the South in 70s and early 80s, and that was not, people didn't take well to that. The moonshiners in those regions didn't really like that because it wasn't a traditional crop. It wasn't a traditional activity to be growing marijuana, that's for sure. Well, so I guess today with the parallels with marijuana, it's now legal in many states. So there are some parallels, but again, with the legality of it, it's a little bit different. You don't have to hide out anymore to grow and to sell.
Well, take us again as the world goes. America is a young country, and yet from almost day one, moonshine has been happening in the country. Is America the birthplace of moonshining, or could we find it in other places around the world and we kind of adapted it here?
Sure. Well, places across the world have their own version of moonshine. And we talk about moonshine, we're really talking about a clear, unaged liquor. Here we're talking about a whiskey generally, but every country has their own version of this home-distilled spirit. And when we when we talk about moonshine, we're talking about a product for which taxes aren't being paid on it. But of course, in the United States, you had the Irish immigrants and Scots-Irish immigrants coming over and bringing that distilling tradition with them and doing that here in this country. And so at the very birth of this country, you had, one of the very first taxes that our country laid was on distilled spirits. And so all of these people, these farmer distillers on farms in western Pennsylvania, rebelled against this. And this was something traditional that they'd been doing, and they certainly didn't think they should be paying taxes on it. And it almost started our country's first war. It almost was a civil war, all about whiskey.
Why is, and again, part of this show is to crush social stereotypes or at times reinforce them, however you want to look at it. But Why is it? Am I incorrect that most Americans, if you said the word moonshine and that we said point to a place on the map, it would be the Southeast? Is that fair or is that not fair?
I think largely that is where people would be correct, certainly. I mean, most of the moonshining, per se, has been going on traditionally in the Southeast. But when I was researching this book, one of the things that surprised me was that people were making moonshine all over the country, and it wasn't just an isolated thing in the Southeast. In fact, they write about moonshiners in L.A. ranch houses. There were busts going on in Los Angeles. There were moonshiners up in the hills in the Pacific Northwest. I even found stories about a moonshiner, a college professor at Harvard who was making moonshine in a legal, untaxed whiskey in his Back Bay apartment and selling it at Harvard dances, and that was written about as moonshine.
Let's go to a little bit higher level. For many, many years, liquor in and of itself was not banned in this country. As a matter of fact, historically, prohibition is a relatively short period. Mm-hmm. What is it about moonshine that makes it feel sort of, not backwoods, but certainly done, again, at night, done in secret? Why is it so important? Why does moonshine happen when liquor is legal? Help us with
Why
that.
does moonshine happen when liquor is legal?
Right.
It's a good question. I mean, I think what we're coming back to is tradition and folk art and family heritage. And this is something that, again, it's a tradition that's been passed on for generations. And so a lot of times people really prefer that homemade spirit. And so I think even when there was legal liquor, and we see this today, even though there is legal liquor, there's an appeal to this homemade spirit. And there's certainly, during the Depression, when, we had liquor was legal again, you had people who were moonshining in order to support their families. The economic opportunities were pretty limited in many parts of the country. And so turning to a traditional craft, something that you knew how to make, and there was certainly a market for it, that was certainly appealing for many people.
What, as you talk to people, undoubtedly you found there were maybe certain regions of the country, certain regions within regions, certain parts of the South, or certain parts of anywhere. What about historically, Jamie, moonshine families, so to speak, those that maybe made a living and passed it down and passed it down and passed it down? Pretty common?
Oh, yeah. And there's a distiller that I write about from Dawsonville, Georgia, and she has a legal distillery. Her name is Cheryl Wood, and she's got a distillery in Dawsonville, which is north of Atlanta, Dawsonville Moonshine Distillery, and she's a great example of somebody who took an illegal family business and made it legitimate. I mean, she comes from a long line of illegal distillers. Her grandfather, Simi Free, made moonshine in North Georgia. It was very renowned in that part of the country, and she decided at one point, when it became legal in Georgia to have these distilleries, that she would take this illegal family business and make it legitimate. So I think that's a really strong piece of history that people are very proud of.
If you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck again of Lewis at Large Radio. We are in the midst of some Smart Talk Radio here, talking moonshine, a brand new work by Joyce, an editor at Time Inc. Her work has appeared in numerous places online, Edible Brooklyn, Edible Manhattan. She's also a member of the Big Round Table, which is a really fascinating website for long-form narrative nonfiction. The work, again, is called Moonshine, A Cultural History of America's Infamous Liquor. Jamie, I know I could understand all kinds of people make home brew. They enjoy it at home, et cetera, et cetera. Moonshine, a little bit broader than that. We make the moonshine, then we want to sell it. And again, it's not the same, but like the marijuana dealer, how did the word get out in a lot of these smaller communities that, hey, Sam down the street is making some good moonshine, and then therefore, when word traveling like that in a smaller community, how do the authorities not find out about it?
Well, authorities certainly knew about it, but they had to catch people in the process of making it or catch them carrying a load of whiskey. And so that's why, and I tell a story about a lot of these drivers. They called them whiskey trippers. Well, it was well known who these whiskey trippers were in different communities across the country, but you had to catch up with them. And that was part of how we ended up with the sport of NASCAR. We had all of these whiskey trippers who knew how to drive fast and elude the authorities, and a lot of them turned out to be some of our first NASCAR drivers. So it's a little bit, it answers your question, but it goes into a little bit of a different topic that's covered in the book for sure.
Yeah, no, I was going to say there within the book are some tremendous illustrations and graphics. There's also some great quotes, which we'll read a couple of them later. There's one by William Faulkner talking about it. What is it if I had to choose between moonshine? Was it nothing and scotch? Because scotch is closest to moonshine?
I think so. I'd have to check back. I don't recall exactly, but you're pretty close.
It's close. Anyway, what is it? Moonshine has been documented, obviously, in documentaries, but it has also certainly played a part in a lot of movies that are well known. What about the role of moonshine, or how moonshine appears in some? You mentioned NASCAR, but what about in some other things? Maybe in the movies, in other books, in other roles or characters that we would all know.
Oh, yeah. Well, Thunder Road is a really popular movie. I mean, it's a cult classic, and that's a Robert Mitchum film. I believe it was 1958 it was released. And that was, it remains popular today. I mean, it didn't even go on to DVD until maybe 30 years after its release, because it was still being shown at drive-in theaters. It was a really popular thing for people to do, of course, when we still had drive-in theaters, but those are disappearing across our country, sadly. And then, of course, you've got lots of television shows that talk about moonshine. I mean, Dukes of Hazzard in the late 70s, early 80s, that was all about moonshining. I certainly didn't realize that when I was a kid watching that show, but, that was hugely popular. And, of course, there's so much music, and I include in the book a playlist of about 10 songs that all have to do with moonshine. And it really helps me write this book, was listening to my moonshine playlist. It's so embedded in the culture that way.
So I love the idea that we have a modern-day writer listening to some kind of an iPad when songs about moonshine.
That's right.
Jamie, I would think the real moonshiners would want you to maybe whistle. Wouldn't that be more what they
perhaps. I'm not a very good whistler, so they'll have to get somebody else for that.
Well, and again, we say moonshine on the cover of the book has some wonderful replacements for that. Sugar whiskey, rot gut, of course. I like panther piss. That's a delicate one.
That's a pretty good one, yeah. And sugar shine I love, too, because that really speaks to what started happening in a lot of places in this country. I mean, instead of making this liquor with corn, a lot of people were just using tons of sugar to make it.
Yeah.
And it got to be so bad that, these sugar manufacturers were really finding, well, why are we selling millions of pounds of sugar to these rural areas? Well, they're certainly not baking pies and making cakes and preserves. It's all going into liquor.
Is it possible to buy what would, and again, there must be as many families as there are out there that make moonshine, there must be that many recipes. But if we were to take sort of a middle-of-the-road moonshine recipe, is it possible to go into a liquor store and buy it? Is there manufacturers that make it, so to speak, pure to the recipe?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the most popular moonshine whiskeys that's on the market today is Junior Johnson's Midnight Moon, and that's made in Piedmont Distillers in North Carolina, and that is based on Junior Johnson's family recipe. So you can go out and get that. I mean, that's available across the country. You can get it at Walmart, at Costco. There's another brand, Old Smoky Tennessee Whiskey, Tennessee Moonshine, and that's very popular, again, based on traditional recipes.
Right. You got your graduate degree from Columbia University, a hallowed learned institution for sure. I'm sure you were taught the value of a balanced story. I'm curious, as you were doing your research and you talked to those that manufactured, and you may have spent some time talking to either those that make laws or those that enforce laws, and I'm curious on this entire subject the two sides had very different views, probably, of moonshine, its value, and its worth. Did they have anything in common?
Well, one of the people that I spoke to in Dawsonville, Georgia, I went to, and it's called the Old Moonshiners of Georgia reunion. And at that reunion, there were lots of these old moonshiners, people who had been making it illegally, and then there were revenue agents who were there. So I spoke to a gentleman who was, his job was to go after the moonshiners in his community. And a lot of times he would know these people personally, but it was just something that's his job and that's their job, and you all live together, and everybody's doing what they have to do to make a living. So that was really interesting to see those people coming together.
Similar to maybe organized crime, were there areas like the Smith family somewhere in a neighborhood or a community is it possible to be territorial with your moonshine? Like, don't you start an operation, I own the franchise, so to speak, in this area. Did that ever come up, or was everybody kind of the more the merrier?
Oh, that would definitely come up, and there's a great song, Rocky Top, which I think most people are familiar with as a fight song, for the Tennessee football team.
Yep.
And you're talking about good old Rocky Top, and if you come up on that hill, you're not going to come down, because people were very territorial and very protective of their operations. Absolutely. And so while businesses could coexist, there was certainly everybody takes pride in their product.
What did if we were to look at the laws now that are on the books regarding moonshine, are they materially different at all than what they were maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago?
Well, the laws really, making homemade whiskey is still illegal, whereas making home brew is legal, making small quantities of wine is legal, but we're still talking about, this high-proof, volatile, highly flammable moonshine whiskey that is one reason that this is illegal, so that's pretty much stayed the same. And of course, the government wants to collect its taxes, so those laws are pretty much unchanged when it comes to making distilled spirits.
Is there any, and speaking, I want to follow up on this on the law, is there any attempt by the moonshining community or others to update those laws at all or change them?
Absolutely. There are lots of hobby distillers out there who are working to create to change the laws to allow home distillers to make small quantities of liquor. Certainly not large-scale operations, but small operations. It's legal to purchase a still. You can go online and buy a copper pot still, but it's illegal to then use that still to make liquor. So it's a little confusing, and I know that I have a friend who tried to purchase one of these stills, and lo and behold, what ends up happening is if you try to purchase, or you do purchase one of those stills, you'll get a notice from the federal government saying, hey, we know what you're doing. Now, don't think you're going to make alcohol with that, because that's illegal. So it's a bit of a catch-22 there.
Okay, so tell us, in the course of your research, undoubtedly, just to make sure you were talking about the real thing, you sampled moonshine throughout. Did you notice in your research a real difference in quality / taste / anything in the different samples that you did during your research?
Oh, sure. There's definitely there's some that I tried that was pretty much fire water is a really good way to describe it, and that's why I think that's one of the names that I have on the cover of the book, because it really burns when you drink it. And others are just incredibly smooth and just had a nice aroma to them. And so those were then fun things to drink during this research process.
What about, let's look at gender here. What about the stereotype would be sort of a bent-over thin guy wearing overalls, no shirt at his still, and maybe even with a piece of straw in his mouth. What about women that moonshine? Would you come across any evidence that there are certain groups of women that were doing the same thing?
Absolutely. And when I started this book, I came at it thinking, I had that stereotype, I had that picture in my head of this is what the moonshiner looked like, and I knew that there had to be women who were doing this. There's no way that this was exclusively a male thing. And in fact, I found many, many women who were involved in this, and I tell a story in the book about a woman in the late 1800s, and she was in New Jersey, and they called her Moonshine. Really, she was Moonshine Nancy the Moonshiner, rather. And here was somebody who was making Applejack, and that's an illegal. It's an liquor made from apples, and she was stealing apples from a local orchard, and the authorities came after her. And she's a terrific story. And there's a woman in this is Moonshine Mary, and she was in Chicago, or outside of Chicago rather, and she was making this liquor to support her family. She was a Polish immigrant, and she ended up going to prison because she was found to be selling some of her liquor that was selling for about 15 cents a shot, ended up killing a man because of the poor production quality of it. And so there's lots of stories like that I tell in the book. And certainly, going back to the woman I mentioned earlier, Cheryl Wood in Dawsonville, Georgia. I mean, here's a woman who's a legal distiller and carrying on a family tradition. So they're out there throughout history, and they're out there today. Troy and Sons Moonshine is a terrific maker in North Carolina, and that's a female-owned business, and she's making really delicious stuff.
What, as we start to wind down here a little bit, Jamie, you did a lot of research here. Most people probably can go 2 or 3 sentences deep on their knowledge of moonshine. Now you can talk for half an hour with me about it. But
sure.
As you did your research and as you look back on all this, what is, if there's such a thing, a misconception maybe that you had / the rest of us have about moonshine as an entity and maybe its cultural history and the people that are involved? What was sort of maybe an interesting fact or an interesting maybe concept maybe we had not thought of before?
Well, I think that people, when you think about moonshine, there is the stereotype of it being sort of unsophisticated, and the people who are making it are maybe there's that hillbilly stereotype. And in fact, moonshiners, they're running a business historically. I mean, we're talking about people who they're producing a product, they're delivering it, and that takes smarts. And so we're not talking about unsophisticated people. We're talking about people who know how to run a very successful business. So I think that really blasts that hillbilly stereotype out of the water.
What about the colleagues that you run with, not only at Time but also in the just a whole editorial community in the Northeast? What when they heard you were doing this work, what kind of reaction did you get?
They say, well, be careful for those moonshiners. Be careful. You're going to go out in the backwoods. And it turned out to be, I was perfectly safe and was certainly welcomed by all of these terrific distillers across the country. And, of course, everybody now wants to try moonshine once I talk about it. They all want to go out and get their Junior Johnson Midnight Moon or try it at a bar and a cocktail. So I think people have been pleasantly surprised by the taste of it.
Well, indeed, and again, this interview will be airing first on a Sunday morning, so I'm not sure at this time in the morning you can run out and buy some, but you could certainly make some this morning, I would think. Hey, one last thing here, and
sure.
That is, I would think that the families that you talk to and the individuals that you talk to that produce this product have, number one, it's hard work, and number two, it was made with enormous pride.
Absolutely.
That, to me, it's almost a mark of who they are. It's almost like a family brand, I would think.
Absolutely. I mean, it's really, as you said, there's such pride in the product, and there's such pride in the family tradition. I mean, it's folk art, it's heritage, and I think it's a true American spirit. It really speaks to American independence and ingenuity, and that made this book so much fun to research, so much fun to write, and I think it'll be, hopefully, fun for people to read.
Well, again, the work is called Moonshine, A Cultural History of America's Infamous Liquor, this amazing sort of love-hate relationship that our country has always had with liquor in general. It's published by Zenith Press. The author, again, Jamie Joyce, who is an editor at Time. Jamie, how can people find out more, not only about the book, get a copy of it, but also some of the other writings that you do?
Sure. You can check out my website. It's jamiejoyce.com, and that's JAIMEJOYCE. And you can certainly go on to Amazon to order the book or get it at your local bookstore. I support that.
Well, good. We appreciate your time today. Thank you for the work. Again, this may be the only show we ever do exclusively on moonshine, but thank you for being a part of that. And by the way, what's the next project?
Oh, gosh, I've got a few ideas, but I'm not ready to reveal them yet. But looking forward to diving into something new very soon.
Okay, well, we would love to have you back on again. Again, thanks so much for being a part of the show.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
You bet. We'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.